Miami International Airport, July 12, 2022. A private jet from Colombia touches down on runway 17R at exactly 3:47 a.m., its engines cutting through the humid darkness that hangs over South Florida like a suffocating blanket. The air conditioning units throughout the terminal hum constantly, fighting against the oppressive heat that never truly leaves Miami, even during the pre-dawn hours when most of the city sleeps. The customs manifest lists the cargo as medical equipment destined for a pharmaceutical distributor in downtown Miami, part of a legitimate trade relationship that has existed between American companies and Colombian suppliers for over a decade. But inside one ordinary-looking black duffel bag, vacuum-sealed and wrapped in multiple layers of industrial plastic, sits $12 million in cartel cash that has been laundering through American banks for months, representing the accumulated profits from drug sales, human trafficking, weapons smuggling, and extortion operations that stretch from the streets of Miami to the mountains of Colombia. This is the story of how Eric Mendes, a low-paid baggage handler with 2 Iraq tours and an unquestioned security clearance, outsmarted drug lords, airport security, and federal agents using only patience, military training, and understanding of how airports work when nobody watches the invisible workers. He had no weapons except intelligence, no crew except discipline, no technology except a radio, key card, and perfect knowledge of the 15-minute window when $12 million sat unguarded on a cart in America's most surveilled airport. The theft took 11 minutes, executed with military precision by someone who understood that spectacular crimes succeed by looking like routine procedures. No alarms, no violence, no witnesses except cameras that recorded everything but revealed nothing suspicious to investigators analyzing what appeared to be standard baggage handling by an employee with a clean background check. Eric Mendes vanished without a trace, becoming a ghost who walked away with aviation history's largest cash theft. Eric was 31 when he decided to rob a Colombian cartel, despite everything suggesting he was wrong for such a crime against an organization where theft meant death. Born in Homestead to Nicaraguan immigrants fleeing civil war, he grew up believing honest work was the only path to American success. His father, Roberto, spent 20 years building houses in brutal South Florida heat, saving to buy a home and send Eric to community college. Eric studied criminal justice, planning to become a police officer after positive childhood experiences with law enforcement. But September 11th changed everything, convincing him military service was both patriotic duty and practical career preparation. Eric enlisted in 2003, serving 2 Iraq combat tours that fundamentally changed his worldview. First as infantry conducting Baghdad patrols where IEDs killed soldiers daily, then as logistics specialist managing supply operations at forward bases where security was constant and attention to detail meant life or death for hundreds depending on his competence. Military service taught Eric systematic thinking about complex operations, identifying security vulnerabilities, and moving valuable cargo through hostile territory without attracting deadly attention. Most importantly, he learned that successful missions required blending completely with normal operations until it was too late to prevent whatever was happening. Eric received honorable discharge in 2009 with commendations and recommendation letters praising his reliability and performance under pressure. His logistics, security, and planning skills should have translated easily to civilian law enforcement or contractor work. But civilian transition proved difficult due to economic conditions and a job market flooded with veterans. His community college criminal justice degree was outdated, police departments were cutting budgets, and available positions went to 4-year university graduates. Employers didn't understand how combat experience translated to business needs and often avoided hiring veterans due to PTSD stereotypes. Eric spent 2 years in temporary jobs, barely covering rent and child support for a daughter from a pre-deployment relationship. His ex-girlfriend had married while he was overseas, creating complicated dynamics where he paid for a child he saw only every other weekend. Payments consumed half his income, leaving nothing for savings or emergencies. In 2020, Eric found steady work as a baggage handler at Miami International Airport with Skyline Ground Services, handling international flights. The job required extensive background checks for restricted area access, but his military record and clean history made him ideal for work most considered temporary and low skill, Starting at $15 hourly with overtime opportunities and benefits, Eric finally had stable employment, allowing future planning rather than paycheck-to-paycheck survival. He distinguished himself as a valued worker, punctual, careful with equipment, professional with crews and passengers. Eric learned complex logistics systems moving millions of bags daily through conveyor belts, sorting facilities, and transport vehicles requiring clockwork precision. Most importantly, he observed how security procedures worked in practice versus theory, identifying vulnerabilities and understanding how performance pressure created routine shortcuts and exceptions. Miami International processes 40 million annual passengers and billions in cargo between the U.S. and Latin America. But beneath official statistics, law enforcement recognizes MIA as a primary drug trafficking transit point. Geographic advantages attracting legitimate business also serve criminal organizations moving drugs, money, and people between South America and U.S. markets. Private jets provide perfect cover because VIP flight inspections are often cursory and aircraft owners have political influence, ensuring enforcement doesn't interfere with economically valuable operations. Traffic volume makes thorough aircraft inspection impossible, creating opportunities for organizations exploiting gaps between official procedures and practical limitations. Eric noticed patterns experienced workers ignored. Aircraft arriving on unusual schedules during minimal traffic periods, security personnel avoiding specific areas during certain shifts creating predictable coverage gaps, ground crews instructed to handle certain cargo without normal inspections, and Colombian private jets receiving preferential customs treatment with quick inspections rather than detailed examination, supposedly standard for potential trafficking-connected flights. One aircraft in particular caught Eric's attention because of the precision of its operations and the obvious care taken to ensure that its cargo was handled differently from routine freight that moved through normal channels. A Gulfstream G650, registered to a pharmaceutical company called MedCorp International, would arrive every 3 weeks, always landing between 3:30 and 4 a.m. when airport traffic was minimal and staffing levels were reduced to skeleton crews responsible for handling only the most essential operations. The aircraft was registered in Delaware, but operated by a crew that spoke Spanish as their primary language and carried themselves with the professional demeanor of people who had experience in military or law enforcement operations. They always carried 3 identical black duffel bags that were transferred directly from the aircraft to a waiting vehicle without passing through normal customs inspection procedures that were supposed to apply to all cargo entering the United States from foreign countries. Eric learned through careful observation and casual conversations with other ground crew members that the aircraft was connected to operations that everyone understood, but nobody discussed openly, because workers who had been at the airport for several years knew which flights required special handling and which questions should never be asked if they wanted to keep their jobs and avoid attracting unwanted attention from people who might not appreciate curiosity about their business activities. The pharmaceutical company owning the Gulfstream had legitimate medical distributor connections throughout South Florida, providing perfect cover for cargo that might not survive detailed scrutiny. Their business records showed legal, documented medical equipment shipments, creating paper trails satisfying routine investigations while concealing other transported items. During his second year, Eric systematically studied the Gulfstream's operations, gathering intelligence about security procedures and timing protecting the black duffel bags. The bags were unloaded by 2 men working with military precision, communicating through hand signals rather than monitored radio frequencies. Clearly professionals following protocols developed through extensive experience. Bags were loaded onto cargo carts and moved to secure storage for exactly 45 minutes before transfer to a white panel van, leaving through a rarely monitored service entrance. Eric repeatedly timed the operation, discovering it followed identical schedules with maximum 5-minute variations despite weather or delays. Most importantly, during a 15-minute window between unloading and storage, duffel bags sat unattended while handlers met with customs officials. Eric observed the bags were heavier than medical equipment should be, secured with substantial locks, and emitted the faint odor characteristic of stored cash. Eric spent 6 months developing a theft plan using military logistics techniques requiring careful timing and contingency planning. Airport security systems prevent bringing dangerous items in, not authorized personnel removing items that appear legitimate. His clearance and work patterns allowed free movement, and his reputation ensured security wouldn't question his presence. Eric's plan exploited the 15-minute unattended window, substituting real bags with identical replica filled with fake money passing casual inspection. Real bags would hide in maintenance areas accessible through his work, then removal via legitimate waste disposal procedures appearing like routine activities. Eric acquired materials using cash purchases across South Florida to avoid traceable records. He bought identical duffel bags and materials for convincing counterfeit money, researched currency bundle appearance at banks, and practiced substitution procedures until completing operations in under 3 minutes without mistakes. Eric contacted former military colleagues for untraceable identity documents and transportation. Marcus Thompson, a former Army intelligence specialist, provided complete new identity documentation and background records for international travel without electronic trails. Eric identified maintenance tunnels beneath Terminal D, providing secure storage access outside camera coverage. His baggage handler position gave legitimate tunnel access for equipment maintenance and waste disposal. He constructed a hidden storage compartment inside utility access panels using available maintenance supplies designed for quick access while escaping security detection. Eric also contacted Apex Logistics, a transportation company operated by former military personnel specializing in moving high-value cargo with discretion. They would provide vehicles and drivers for his escape using routes minimizing law enforcement detection, with extensive experience moving people and cargo across international boundaries without official records. Everything was scheduled for July 12, 2022, when the Gulf Stream was expected to arrive with its regular shipment of cartel money that would soon belong to a baggage handler who had learned how to exploit the weaknesses in airport security that nobody else had noticed or been bold enough to act upon. July 12, 2022, 3:47 a.m. The Gulfstream G650 touched down on runway 17R exactly on schedule, its landing lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as the pilot executed a perfect approach that brought the aircraft to a stop at the private aviation terminal, where customs procedures would be expedited for passengers and cargo that warranted special handling due to the political and economic influence of the aircraft's owners. The landing was routine in every respect, indistinguishable from thousands of other private aircraft operations that used Miami International Airport as their entry point for business activities throughout South Florida and the broader southeastern United States. Air traffic controllers processed the flight using standard procedures, and ground crews prepared to service the aircraft according to protocols that had been established through years of experience with similar operations. Eric was working his regular shift, positioned to handle baggage operations for international flights that arrived during the overnight hours when staffing levels were minimal and security protocols were relaxed enough to allow efficient processing of legitimate cargo while maintaining the appearance of normal oversight. He had volunteered for the overnight shift specifically because it provided access to operations that were less closely monitored and offered opportunities that would not exist during busy daytime hours when dozens of supervisors and security personnel were present throughout the airport. Eric monitored radio communications as the aircraft completed its taxi procedures and positioned itself for unloading operations at a gate that was isolated from passenger terminals and provided direct access to cargo handling facilities where valuable shipments could be processed without attracting attention from travelers or airport visitors who might observe activities that were intended to remain private. He could hear the routine exchanges between ground control, customs officials, and the flight crew that indicated everything was proceeding according to normal procedures that had been followed dozens of times before. There was nothing in the radio traffic to suggest that anyone suspected the aircraft was carrying anything other than the medical equipment listed on its customs documentation, which had been prepared by professionals who understood exactly what information would satisfy routine inspections without triggering detailed scrutiny. At 4:02 a.m., the Gulfstream's cargo door opened, and the same two men Eric had observed during previous operations began unloading 3 black duffel bags with the careful precision he had come to expect from their work. They moved with military efficiency, handling the bags like they contained something far more valuable than medical equipment, but maintaining the professional demeanor that would not attract unwanted attention from airport personnel who might be watching their activities. They loaded the bags onto a standard cargo cart and began moving toward the secure storage area where customs inspection would be conducted away from the public areas of the terminal, following a route that Eric had memorized through months of careful observation. Eric followed at a distance, pushing his own cart loaded with legitimate baggage from other flights, maintaining the appearance of routine work activities while positioning himself to take advantage of the opportunity he had been planning for months. At 4:08 a.m., the two handlers disappeared into the terminal building for their routine meeting with customs officials who would provide whatever documentation was necessary to ensure that the cargo could be transported without interference from other law enforcement agencies that might ask inconvenient questions about its contents or origins. This left the cargo cart unattended in the secure area exactly as Eric had observed during previous operations, providing him with the 15-minute window he needed to execute his plan. Eric had 11 minutes before the handlers would return, but his plan required only 7 minutes to execute successfully if everything went according to the procedures he had rehearsed hundreds of times until every movement became automatic. He approached the unattended cart and quickly identified the duffel bag that matched the intelligence he had gathered about the cartel's money storage procedures, using visual cues that he had learned to recognize during months of observation. The bag was heavier than the others and secured with locks that appeared more substantial than those used for routine medical equipment, confirming Eric's assessment that it contained something far more valuable than pharmaceutical supplies. Eric substituted his replica bag for the genuine article, working with the smooth efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the operation dozens of times until every movement became automatic and he could complete the substitution without conscious thought or hesitation. The real duffel bag was loaded into Eric's cleaning cart and covered with legitimate waste materials that provided perfect camouflage for transporting $12 million through airport security checkpoints that were designed to detect weapons and explosives rather than stolen money that was being moved by someone with legitimate access to restricted areas. Eric moved calmly toward the maintenance tunnel entrance, maintaining the same pace he used during routine waste disposal procedures that were conducted throughout his shift as part of normal custodial responsibilities. At 4:13 a.m., Eric reached the maintenance tunnel and transferred the stolen money to his hidden storage compartment, working in complete darkness to avoid attracting attention from security cameras that might record his activities and provide evidence that could later be analyzed by investigators who would spend months trying to understand how $12 million had disappeared from one of the most secure airports in America. The money would remain hidden until after his shift ended, giving him time to complete normal work responsibilities while establishing an alibi that would be documented through routine employee monitoring systems that track the movements and activities of airport personnel throughout their shifts. Eric returned to the secure area and resumed normal baggage handling duties, observing from a distance as the two cartel operatives returned to collect their cargo cart and transport the duffel bags to their waiting vehicle. They showed no indication that they suspected anything unusual had occurred during their absence, conducting routine security checks that focused on external threats rather than the possibility that one of their bags had been replaced with a carefully crafted replica. The substitution had been executed perfectly, with the fake money providing enough weight and bulk to pass casual inspection by handlers who were not expecting to encounter sophisticated deception. At 4:47 a.m., the white panel van left the airport carrying two genuine duffel bags and one replica that contained $12 million worth of counterfeit currency that had been created with enough skill to fool anyone who was not specifically examining it for evidence of fraud. The cartel's operation had proceeded exactly according to their established routine, with no indication that they had been robbed by a baggage handler who understood their security procedures better than they understood them themselves. Eric completed his shift at 8 a.m., clocking out through normal procedures and exchanging casual conversation with co-workers who would later tell investigators that he appeared completely normal during what had been the most profitable 8 hours of his life. Eric retrieved the stolen money from his hidden storage compartment and transferred it to a large toolbox that provided legitimate cover for removing valuable cargo from airport property without attracting attention from security personnel who might question unusual activities. At 8:30 a.m., Eric met his transportation contact at a service entrance that was not monitored by security cameras due to its location in an industrial area of the airport that was used primarily for waste removal and utility maintenance activities that were considered routine and low risk. The contact was driving a panel truck that belonged to Apex Logistics, providing perfect cover for someone who needed to leave airport property without attracting attention from security personnel who might question unusual vehicles or unfamiliar faces in restricted areas. Eric loaded his toolbox into the truck and climbed into the passenger seat, beginning a journey that would take him far from Miami and the life he had built over 31 years in South Florida. He had successfully stolen $12 million from one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the world, and now he needed to disappear before anyone realized what had happened and began the kind of investigation that would eventually lead to his capture and execution. The truck drove north on Interstate 95, maintaining normal traffic speeds and following routes that had been planned to minimize contact with law enforcement agencies that might later be searching for someone matching Eric's description. The driver was a former Marine named Carlos Rodriguez, who understood operational security and asked no questions about his passenger or cargo, focusing instead on executing his transportation responsibilities with the same attention to detail that had kept him alive during 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan. Eric had spent months preparing for this moment, and every aspect of his escape plan had been designed to ensure that he could vanish completely before law enforcement agencies even realized a crime had been committed. He had new identification documents that would pass routine inspection, offshore bank accounts that could not be traced through normal financial investigation techniques, and contacts in several countries who could provide assistance to someone with enough money to pay for their discretion and protection. By noon on July 12th, Eric Mendes was in North Carolina, staying at a safe house operated by people who specialize in helping individuals disappear when their continued existence in their previous lives had become dangerous or impossible. The safe house was run by former intelligence operatives who understood how to provide security and logistical support for clients who needed to vanish without leaving traces that could be followed by sophisticated investigation techniques. By July 14th, he had crossed into Canada using documentation that would pass routine border inspection, but would provide no useful information to investigators who might later attempt to track his movements. The border crossing was conducted at a remote location where security was minimal, and Eric's new identity was accepted without question by guards who processed hundreds of legitimate travelers every day and had no reason to suspect that they were allowing a fugitive to escape. By July 16th, he was on a cargo ship bound for South America, carrying a new identity and enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life in countries where $12 million would provide not just financial security, but also the kind of political protection that makes it possible to avoid extradition, even if law enforcement agencies eventually discover your location. Eric Mendes had successfully executed the perfect crime by understanding that the most effective way to steal millions of dollars was to make the theft look exactly like routine work procedures that nobody would think to question. The theft wasn't discovered until July 15th, 3 days after Eric had vanished with $12 million in cartel money, when the duffel bags reached their destination in Colombia and cartel representatives opened them to begin the money counting procedures that were standard practice for verifying shipments and ensuring that none of their associates were skimming funds during transportation operations. They found 2 bags containing genuine currency that matched their expectations, but the third bag was filled with counterfeit bills that had been created with enough skill to pass casual inspection, but were obviously fake when examined closely by people who handled large amounts of cash on a regular basis and knew exactly what authentic currency should look like, feel like, and smell like after months of storage and transportation. The discovery triggered immediate panic within the organization, because losing $12 million represented more than just financial damage. It was evidence that their security procedures had been compromised by someone with inside knowledge of their operations, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by law enforcement agencies or rival criminal organizations that might be planning larger attacks against their infrastructure. The cartel's response was immediate and brutal, following patterns of violence that had been established over decades of dealing with theft, betrayal, and other threats to their operations. The 2 operatives who had been responsible for maintaining security during the theft were brought to a warehouse facility in Bogota for interrogation that continued for hours before their bodies were found in a canal outside the city, serving as a warning to other employees that failure to protect cartel assets would be punished with death, regardless of circumstances or explanations. The pilot and co-pilot of the Gulfstream were questioned extensively, but released after convincing cartel leadership that they had no knowledge of or involvement in the substitution, and that their responsibilities were limited to transportation rather than cargo security. The aircraft was inspected thoroughly for evidence of tampering or surveillance equipment that might have been installed by law enforcement agencies, but nothing was found that would explain how someone had gained access to information about the money shipments. The cartel's investigation quickly focused on Miami International Airport, where someone with inside knowledge and access to restricted areas had obviously been responsible for the theft. Cartel representatives began pressuring airport employees who had been involved in handling their cargo, using intimidation tactics that resulted in one baggage handler disappearing permanently and several others requesting transfers to other facilities where they would not be exposed to similar risks. But the investigation revealed nothing useful about Eric Mendes, who had successfully maintained his cover as a routine employee throughout months of planning and preparation that had required him to gather intelligence while appearing completely normal to co-workers and supervisors who might have reported suspicious behavior to security personnel. His work records showed no unusual behavior, no unexplained absences, and no connections to criminal organizations that might have motivated or facilitated the theft. To everyone who worked with him, Eric had been exactly what he appeared to be, a reliable, unremarkable employee who performed his job competently without attracting attention or causing problems that would require supervisory intervention. His military background was well known and respected by co-workers who understood that veterans often made excellent employees due to their discipline and attention to detail. But nobody suspected that his combat experience and logistics training had prepared him to execute sophisticated criminal operations. The FBI became involved in the investigation when the cartel's pressure on airport employees attracted attention from federal agents who were already monitoring drug trafficking operations at MIA as part of ongoing investigations into international criminal organizations that use South Florida as their primary entry point for illegal activities throughout the United States. Special Agent Rebecca Torres was assigned to lead the investigation due to her experience with organized crime cases and her understanding of how criminal organizations use legitimate businesses to facilitate their operations while maintaining the appearance of lawful commercial activity. Agent Torres had spent 15 years investigating drug trafficking and money laundering operations, and she quickly realized that the theft had been executed by someone with sophisticated understanding of airport operations and security procedures. The substitution required precise timing, detailed knowledge of the cartel's routines, and access to restricted areas that was available only to employees with appropriate security clearances and established work patterns that would not attract attention from supervisors or security personnel. The investigation focused on identifying airport personnel who had the skills and access necessary to execute such a professional operation, but the search initially produced hundreds of potential suspects who met the basic criteria. The search of Eric's apartment revealed that he had been planning his disappearance for months, carefully eliminating every trace of his previous life while preparing for a future that would require him to live under a completely different identity in a location where law enforcement agencies would be unable to find him. His lease had been paid through the end of July, but the apartment was empty except for his airport uniform, which was found neatly folded on his bed with his security credentials placed on top like a resignation letter. All personal belongings had been removed, and there were no documents or other evidence that might provide clues about his intended destination or the methods he had used to acquire new identification and transportation. The apartment had been cleaned thoroughly to remove fingerprints and DNA evidence that might have provided forensic leads, suggesting that Eric understood how criminal investigations worked and had taken appropriate countermeasures. Financial investigation revealed that Eric had closed all bank accounts and credit cards during the weeks preceding the theft, converting his assets to cash and eliminating electronic trails that might have allowed investigators to track his movements after the crime. His cell phone service had been discontinued, his vehicle had been sold to a used car dealer who paid cash and kept minimal records, and he had made no airline reservations or other arrangements that would have created records of his travel plans. Computer forensics specialists found evidence that Eric had researched offshore banking procedures, identity document creation, and international travel requirements during the months preceding the theft, using public computers at libraries and internet cafes to avoid creating electronic records that could be traced back to his home or workplace. He had visited websites related to expatriate communities in several countries, suggesting that he had been planning to relocate permanently rather than simply hide until the investigation ended. The FBI's investigation expanded to include Eric's military service records, which revealed that he had received training in logistics operations, security procedures, and intelligence gathering that would have provided him with skills necessary for planning and executing the theft. His combat experience in Iraq had taught him to operate in hostile environments where attention to detail and operational security were essential for survival, and where the ability to blend in with normal activities could mean the difference between completing a mission successfully and being killed by enemy forces. Investigators also discovered that Eric had maintained contact with former military colleagues who had experience in intelligence operations and private security work that often required them to operate in legal gray areas where official oversight was minimal and client confidentiality was paramount. Some of these individuals had questionable connections to mercenary organizations and private military contractors who operated throughout Latin America and Africa, providing services to clients who needed assistance with activities that could not be conducted through normal commercial or governmental channels. The FBI suspected that Eric had used these contacts to obtain assistance with documentation, transportation, and other resources necessary for his escape. But interviews with his former military colleagues revealed nothing useful, because people with intelligence training understand how to maintain operational security even when questioned by law enforcement agencies that have significant legal authority to compel cooperation. Despite extensive investigation by federal agents and international law enforcement agencies that continued for more than a year after the theft, Eric Mendes was never located, and investigators eventually concluded that he had probably escaped to a country without extradition treaties with the United States, possibly using documentation provided by former military contacts who understood how to create identities that would be difficult for law enforcement agencies to detect or trace through normal investigative techniques. The FBI believes he successfully disappeared into one of the many countries throughout Central and South America where American law enforcement has limited jurisdiction and where $12 million would provide enough financial resources to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, while purchasing protection from local authorities who might be approached by investigators seeking information about fugitives. A $500,000 bounty for information leading to Eric's capture appeared on dark web forums within weeks of the theft, indicating that the cartel remained committed to finding him despite the time and resources that had already been invested in the search. The bounty was posted on criminal forums that were monitored by law enforcement agencies, but it also reached individuals throughout the criminal underworld who might have access to information about Eric's location or activities. But the bounty has never been claimed, and no credible sightings have been reported by law enforcement agencies or intelligence sources, suggesting that Eric has successfully maintained his new identity and avoided contact with criminal organizations that might be motivated to turn him in for the reward money. The lack of credible leads has frustrated both law enforcement and the cartel, because $12 million represents a significant loss that cannot be written off as a cost of doing business. Rumors about Eric's location have surfaced periodically in various countries throughout Central and South America, with unconfirmed reports placing him in Belize, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Intelligence agencies have investigated these reports, but found no evidence that would confirm Eric's presence in any of these locations, and most of the rumors appear to be false information spread by people who are hoping to claim the bounty without actually having useful intelligence. The most credible intelligence suggests that he has been living under an assumed identity in a country where $12 million would provide enough financial security to maintain a comfortable lifestyle without attracting attention from local authorities who might be curious about the source of his wealth or his reasons for relocating to their country. Former colleagues who worked with Eric at Miami International Airport remember him as someone who was intelligent, patient, and methodical in his approach to work responsibilities, but who never displayed any indication that he was planning criminal activities or had connections to organizations that might facilitate such activities. One supervisor told investigators that Eric wasn't just smart, he was systematic about everything he did. This wasn't random. This was planned by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and had thought through every possible contingency. The case remains officially open in FBI files, but no active investigation is currently ongoing due to lack of leads and the passage of time since the theft occurred, which has made it increasingly unlikely that new evidence will emerge that could lead to Eric's capture. Agent Torres retired from federal service in 2023, stating in her final report that Eric Mendes represented a new category of criminal who used legitimate employment and military training to execute sophisticated crimes that traditional law enforcement techniques are not well equipped to solve. Airport security procedures at Miami International Airport have been upgraded significantly since the theft, with new protocols requiring two-person teams for handling high-value cargo and enhanced surveillance coverage of areas where valuable shipments are temporarily stored. But security experts acknowledge that determined criminals with inside knowledge will continue finding ways to exploit vulnerabilities in even the most sophisticated security systems. Because the fundamental challenge of balancing security with operational efficiency creates opportunities that can be exploited by people who understand how those systems actually work in practice. The cartel has reportedly changed its money transportation procedures, using different routes and methods that make their operations less predictable and harder to infiltrate by law enforcement agencies or potential thieves who might attempt to replicate Eric's success. But law enforcement agencies believe that the theft has not significantly disrupted their overall operations because $12 million represents only a small fraction of the hundreds of millions of dollars that drug trafficking organizations move through financial systems every year. Eric Mendes achieved something that most criminals can only dream about. He stole an enormous amount of money from extremely dangerous people and disappeared completely, leaving behind no trace of his new identity or location that could be used by law enforcement agencies or criminal organizations to track him down. He understood that the perfect crime requires not just careful planning and execution, but also the ability to vanish so completely that even the most sophisticated investigation techniques cannot find you. $12 million, one stolen duffel bag. A missing man who understood how to exploit the invisibility that comes with wearing a uniform and following procedures that nobody thinks to question. Eric Mendes remains a fugitive, somewhere in the world, living proof that the perfect crime is possible for someone patient enough to plan it properly and disciplined enough to execute it flawlessly. The FBI is still looking, but they may never find him.